Good morning, good afternoon. We are glad to be together again for the fifth in our series of webinars on the topic of workforce reentry. Thank you to those of you who have been joining us over the last 5 weeks, and a warm welcome to anyone who may be logging on for the first time. My name is Sarah Clayton. I am an Executive Vice President with United Minds and have been moderating the Forward to Work webinar series. When we started this series, the context was COVID-19 and our focus was on returning to the workplace. And in a few short weeks, the conversation has shifted pretty dramatically. Twitter and Nationwide have redefined what it means to go to work by announcing plans to move to permanent work from home arrangements for many employees. And the George Floyd killing and other African-American deaths have reignited demand for swift action to address racial inequity. While everyone must be held accountable for taking action for protecting health and safety and advancing inclusivity, primary responsibility is falling to our leaders. And it's not an easy job. Dynamics are changing so quickly that leaders are having to act without a clear view to the future and with limited information. They are facing excruciating decisions that are requiring them to balance commitments to their people with the health of their businesses. Expectations that they be activists and help to address societal issues are higher than ever, and their employees are agitating for change in ways that demand not just talk, but immediate action. And all of this, of course, is happening as the public closely follows along, ready to take their dollars elsewhere should leaders make a misstep. So amidst this extraordinary complexity, how are leaders rising to the occasion? What leadership attributes are needed now more than ever? How can employers help their leaders and people managers build the skill sets needed for this moment? And what issues can leaders expect to grapple with in the longer term? Our session today, Leading in Uncertain Times, addresses these topics head on. And I am delighted to welcome to this series our two guest presenters, Alison Quirk and Kate Bullinger. Alison is the former Chief Human Resources and Citizenship Officer at State Street Corporation, where she led a 500-person global HR organization and was known as the company's cultural architect. Serving as a member of the management committee, she worked closely with the board of directors and leadership to support acquisitions, lead the organization through regulatory changes, improve compensation practices, and develop talent management and C-suite succession processes. Alison also led State Street's foundation and corporate citizenship initiatives. She is currently a member of the board of directors of Legg Mason Global Asset Management. Kate is president of United Minds, Weber Shandwick's in-house consultancy, where she oversees a global team focused on change management, culture transformation, diversity and inclusion, and employee engagement. Prior to joining Weber Shandwick, Kate served as chief of staff to the president and CEO and Chief Communications Officer of the Atlantic Philanthropies, one of the world's largest philanthropic organizations. Before that, she was a partner at Mercer Delta, consulting CEOs and C-suite clients on a full range of organizational development issues. In recent months, she has advised employers on how to manage through the response, reset, and reinvention phases of the COVID-19 crisis. That work has included helping companies to redefine the employer-employee relationship and accelerate critical transformation programs. If you have questions as Kate and Alison speak with us today, please enter them into the Q&A window, and we will reserve the final 15 minutes to address as many of them as we can. Please also note that the slides and recording of this presentation will be distributed to everyone who joined following the session. Kate, over to you.
Thanks, Sarah, and thanks to you all for joining today. If you go to the next slide, Alison and I are thrilled to be here to talk about the role of leaders and managers in an uncertain time, and here's what we plan to cover. The leadership challenge before us, the profile of a leader in these uncertain times, what employees need from leadership now, preparing leaders for re-entry, and then seizing the opportunity for long-term reinvention. So next slide. So today, more than any other time in recent history, leaders are facing a defining moment in their careers and what could be viewed as the greatest change management undertaking of all time, or at least in my career, the greatest change management opportunity that we've seen leaders take on. We've seen a confluence of events that are testing leaders in unprecedented ways. a global pandemic that has caused organizations to virtually shut down or change ways of working overnight, a massive economic downturn and unemployment that's caused leaders to have to reevaluate their structure and manage large-scale layoffs or new ways of working. And in North America, as Sarah said, the death of George Floyd and the protests that have swept across the country in the days since. This quote earlier this week in Axios, I thought really summed up the leadership challenge that leaders in our country and across the globe are facing today. The virus and the renewed focus on racism have greatly accelerated the pace of the bottom-up revolution. The next wave of great leaders will adapt their styles and organizations to harness the passion. The weaker ones will be paralyzed and pummeled by it. So we really think that this period of time is a defining moment for leaders, and those who step up will really be the ones to take their organizations forward in the future. Next slide. And we know that leaders have been called upon to flex different muscles and will be at every turn of this crisis and the phases of it. In other episodes in this series of webinars, we've talked about this model of respond, reset, and reinvent. And from a leadership perspective, we saw that in the respond phase, leaders again had to manage the shutdown and going to remote working setups almost overnight, as well as managing the safety of frontline employees and stakeholder requests coming in from all fronts. Reset is an even more complex leadership challenge that we see most of our clients in right now, because reset's happening at different phases across the globe and in different parts of the company. Figuring out how to bring people back to work safely and well, and how to continue managing in a remote setup continues to be a complex leadership challenge that we see across our clients' industries and sectors. And then reinvent is actually the greatest opportunity in front of leaders today, is to really think about, how do we reinvent? We know that the workplace isn't going to go back to the way it was, and this crisis has really accelerated change. So what do leaders need to do to take advantage of that change and redefine how they work, how they're structured organizationally, the kinds of talent they need, and the goals that they want to set coming out of this crisis? Next slide. In addition to all those organizational challenges, we know that leaders are facing a lot of other needs coming from stakeholders in and outside the organization. So for instance, changes to the way products and services are delivered and changing consumer needs. We've also all talked about the interruption of supply chains and having to run your business when the delivery of goods and services is unpredictable, and how do they address that? We've mentioned layoffs and large-scale organizational restructuring happening in ways in a time frame that's so compressed, things that would normally take months or even years are having to happen in a matter of weeks. And then there's this heightened expectation for corporate leadership on CSR, diversity, equity, and inclusion, and community support. Next slide. And I think one of the most interesting things we've seen about this crisis is the rise of anxiety and the attention that's been on it. And we know that anxiety is plaguing people across all aspects of their lives. So you can see here that 7 out of 10 employees say this is the most stressful time in their careers. And we're seeing that echoed in the things that we're hearing from our clients. They're looking for ways to help organizations manage mental health issues in ways that we haven't seen before, doing everything from offering free access to apps like Headspace and Calm, doing manager training so managers are more attuned to mental health issues, and providing greater access to services. This is actually a topic that we previously did on a previous webinar, and if you haven't seen it, you might want to visit that as well. We see consumer spending. Consumers are anxious and spending less by half in the last 2 weeks. And we also know people are concerned about their financial well-being and believe that it's going to take them months, if not years, to get back to where they were in terms of their investments. Next slide. And leaders are no exception. Leaders are on the front line and often expected to step into a crisis and be able to help their people manage through it at the same time. But the only way that leaders can really do that is if they take a moment to sort of get their heads around how they're feeling, what they need to manage well, and to develop the skills that they're going to have at the ready to lead their teams forward. Just a few of the challenges that we see, again, are little opportunity to process events personally before you have to pivot and then help your teams manage through. A lot of managers have never managed remotely before, and the notion of what skills and muscles do you have to pull on to keep teams connected in that format. Making tough decisions. Leaders are having to both make those decisions and communicate them, and delivering difficult news is always a difficult skill for leaders to develop, but it's happening at such a pace right now that they need to really upskill in this area. And I think, through that all, the organizations or employees are looking at leaders and taking cues from their behavior. So they're doing all this under a microscope. So with that, if you go to the next slide, I'm going to hand it over to Alison, who's going to talk about some of the unique skills that we think leaders need to develop during this time period.
Great. Thanks, Kate. So now what we're going to take a look at is not only what organizations can do, but what individual leaders can do as we think about the confluence of issues that Kate just outlined, and these leaders are trying to forge their way into this new normal. The next slide, what we talk about here is compassionate leadership. Compassionate leadership, we say, begins with the intention to see others, see as others see and feel as others feel. Kate described the anxiety that exists in all of us really right now, and this myriad of issues that are coming at us, and we're all being impacted, frankly, in different ways. My experience in 35 years of corporate life is that every leader has a period of time in their tenure that they have to deal with something extraordinary, and it really becomes sort of a flagship of their legacy. How they lead during these times. For me, it was the financial crisis. I was working at a big bank, and that was really sort of probably one of the things that people will remember most about me, and how I led through that crisis. I've also had the long held belief that there are horses for courses as it relates to leadership and situations, that there are certain attributes that are needed from leaders in certain situations. And the extreme challenges that we are facing today, given this confluence of issues with the COVID pandemic, as well as this awakening around racism, is creating a very unique challenge for leaders. In this section, we're going to talk about the traits of a compassionate leader, and we'll use a couple of examples, which let's go to that now. There are 3 examples here of compassionate leadership in action. The first one is a great example. Mayor Keisha Lance Bottoms, the woman on the left. You've probably seen her on TV in response to both COVID and some of the racial tensions in her city of Atlanta. I would urge you, if you haven't read the article, to look at the Wall Street Journal article from June 6th that breaks down a press conference that she did that was enormously impactful. The protests had started around 9:30 in the evening. They got very violent, and she made a decision to do a press conference. She spoke for probably only 4 minutes, but had an enormous impact. If you read the article, they did a good job of explaining why it was so impactful, but a couple of things. She was decisive. She decided she needed to get in front of people right away, and communication was necessary. She was emotional. She was angry, and she was fearful. She was very authentic. She didn't have any notes. She spoke from the heart, and she was empathic. She called herself a mother of 4 Black children, which she is, and said, I know, I'm afraid, and I know how you feel. The second example here is of 2 leaders, actually, I would say, the CEO of American Airlines, Doug Parker, and a flight attendant from Southwest Airlines, Jackie Ray Hill. Ironically, Mr. Parker could not book a seat on an American Airlines flight because they were all full, and he booked a seat on a Southwest flight. And as Jackie Ray was coming to work that morning, she didn't know that she was going to be on the flight with the CEO of American Airlines, but she was feeling quite distraught about and emotional about all of the issues that had been going on around race. And she said she prayed to God on her way to work that she would, have some way to become more settled around this issue. He was reading White Fragility, and he got on the plane with the book White Fragility, and she saw that. And when she had a few minutes after she did some of the things she needed to do on the plane, after the plane took off, she sat down and talked with him. They talked for about 10 minutes. She was very emotional. He was very emotional. And at one point in the conversation, he apologized for the shortcomings of his race and the impact that it has had on her. She hugged him, and when he left the plane, he handed her a handwritten note. And both of these people took the opportunity to have a very real conversation about race in a very unusual place. But, I think it showed a level of authenticity and vulnerability for them to do that. And then there's Brian Chesky, the co-founder and CEO of Airbnb, who he and his leadership team realized that they needed to do some pretty significant layoffs in the face of the COVID crisis. There's a letter that he wrote that's published and widely distributed that you can read that I would consider both clear-eyed and compassionate. I've been involved in writing a lot of communications like this, and I would consider it a masterclass in this type of communication. This was the 7th type communication like this one that he'd made to all employees, so the frequency of his communication was very good. And he said right up front in the letter that he had some very sad news, and he didn't hide it. He didn't use marketing speak. He didn't hide his emotions. He stated the facts very plainly. He admitted that he didn't know everything that the future was going to hold, but he was optimistic about the company's future, but it would come at the price of dramatic change. And towards the end of the letter, he said he had a deep feeling of love for all of the employees. He urged the employees that were not leaving the company to honor the people that were leaving. And to the people that were leaving, he said that he was very sorry. So let's go to the next slide and look at the attributes that we believe will be the profile of a successful, compassionate leader. As you look at these, you may say this is a little bit of motherhood and apple pie, but in times of crisis, it's very hard to focus on some of the real fundamentals that we need to focus on. There are too many other demands. So trustworthiness, if I look at the Brian Chesky letter and I read that, I'm inclined to believe him because of some of the attributes that I already talked about. From a communications perspective, the frequency and the clarity of communications is extremely important. And this issue of two-way communications is extremely important. And it doesn't have to be a formal letter like Brian Chesky wrote. It could be like the American Airlines CEO and the flight attendant, just taking an opportunity to have a meaningful conversation. I was at a presentation by the Massachusetts Governor, Charlie Baker, a couple of years ago, and he said, my mother always told me you have 2 ears and 1 mouth for a reason. You have to listen twice as much as you speak. And I would subscribe to that wisdom myself, that the listening part and asking clarifying questions is very important. Employees need realistic optimism for the future. They need to understand what's coming down the pike so that they can feel a little more settled. And I would say agility is one of the attributes that's going to define a successful leader in this period of time. So flexibility, agility, the ability to pivot not only with your employees, but also with your business models. And empathy. Leaders, as Kate said, have to deal with their own stuff. But employees are coming in the door or virtually into our organizations every day, dealing with their own stuff. And we're going to have to be able to figure out a way to walk in their shoes. So let's get a little bit deeper on the next slide into each of these attributes. The first one is trust. And KRC, who does research inside of the Weber organization, has found that most employees have earned a high level of trust from their organizations. But I would argue that this trust is fleeting and it's very fragile. There's a couple of examples here. Starbucks, who had, opened the stores were open in the beginning of this of the COVID process, but employees felt uncomfortable, so they closed the stores until they were able to put the protocols in place to be able to, make sure that employees were comfortable. Apple's move to add additional paid sick time, Delta's CEO foregoing his salary for 6 months, Costco's decision to institute hazard pay for frontline employees. All of these things, went a long way to earn trust from the employees. On the next slide, employee confidence, again, is directly related to whether or not leaders and companies behave in a manner that is consistent with their values. If those words on your landing page are not consistent with how leaders show up every day, it's the surest way to break the trust with employees. PwC CEO Tim Ryan has been a long time advocate for racial equality and has instituted a number of things that he's actually engaged many CEOs around the world to make similar commitments. And one of the things that they do is they continue to make those commitments and think of new ways to advance this work, probably too many to list. Johnson & Johnson committing $60 million to research why some communities of racial minority are being unevenly impacted by the COVID crisis. And United Health investing $10 million in the community that was impacted in Minneapolis around the race riots, as well as offering to pay for the college education of George Floyd's children. So moving to the next attribute, communications. All of these questions that you see here inside this wheel are things that leaders probably should be paying attention to all the time. But again, it's very hard to stay focused on these things as they're running in the background when there are so many fires burning right in front of you. But if you think about these issues in the context of both COVID and the issues of the heightened awareness around racism, it's time to look at them perhaps a little bit differently. So performance feedback, everybody's experiencing this differently, as I've said in the past few minutes, but the issue is for the people that are handling this remote work, new way of working very well, there is just as many people who are not handling it as well. They don't have the environment, the support system, et cetera, to be able to work very well in this. How are you going to evaluate their performance? After all of this awakening around racism issues, can employees expect to come back to an organization that's going to look at the ways that they hire, evaluate, and promote individuals and to eliminate bias in those systems? Individuals are coming to the workplace with very different needs. How are we going to understand what those different needs are? Humans like to help one another. And they're going to look to leaders to be able to understand how they can do that. They want to have a realistic but optimistic outlook for their future. And, in the ranking of Pavlov's hierarchy, they want to know that they're going to be secure. Are they going to have a job? And if they aren't going to have a job, how are they going to be able to support their families? And what's going to happen in my part of the organization? Make it relevant for people to understand, this is what's going on in the whole company, but this is what's going on sort of in our patch of the company. On the next slide, the more KRC research here shows that the difference between employees' beliefs depending upon the level of communication that they receive from their leaders in their company. And so it's clear that the impact on the employee's commitment to the company is significant depending upon the kind of communication that they receive. And next, there are leaders that have stood out for their effectiveness during the COVID crisis. They have to be consistent, reliable, and predictable in their communication. They have to be committed to listening and learning. And I think these are attributes that Governor Cuomo has shown throughout the crisis. On the next slide, some principles to keep in mind as we move forward here. I'm not going to go through all of them, but just a few things to comment on. Remember that people are watching. It may not feel comfortable all the time, but people are watching leaders. They know when you're there and they are listening to what you say, but they know when you're not showing up. So you need to show up. You can always improve on what you're doing, and asking for feedback is the best way to do that. You're human, you're going to make mistakes, and you won't have all the answers to everything, but that's okay. People will actually respect when you admit that you've made a mistake or that you don't have all the answers. Role modeling and tone from the top are the strongest levers of change that an organization can deploy. So they need to be able to make sure that they are pulling that lever as strong and often as they can. And again, I'll say it again, remember that you've got 2 ears and 1 mouth for a reason. Ask clarifying questions, make sure that you're listening with good intent. You know, on the next slide, we illustrate the fact that communicating around the racial tension that we find ourselves in today can be hard, but that's exactly why we need to do it. And probably why it's been avoided up until now. And here are some critical components to making the efforts around communicating in times like this effective. You know, I've seen some examples recently in my own sphere that have gone very well. There was my alma mater, State Street Corporation, had a town hall focused exclusively on race this week, where the CEO, Ron O'Hanley, spoke to the Chief Diversity Officer, Paul Francisco. And at one point, when Ron asked what he could do differently, Paul was very clear and said, well, you don't have any African Americans on your board, and you don't have any African Americans on your management committee. So, you know, that point was obvious to people already, but to be able to take a question like that on a live town hall, I think was very impactful and showed a level of commitment on both people's parts that they were ready to assist in the change. Next slide. Empathy. You know, I think woven through this whole conversation has been this topic of empathy, you know, and it shows up when you truly listen to people, when you don't interrupt what they're saying, don't defend, you know, sort of any behaviors of the past, be fully present, be careful about your body language, don't judge just because someone thinks very differently from you. There are going to be people in your sphere that are quiet. That doesn't mean that they don't have anything to say. And take a personal interest, you know, to really understand. I think this whole work from home situation has given us insights into people's lives that we didn't have before. And it's probably helped in that way. So these are a few things that I think, you know, leaders need to think about as they think about their ability to be empathic with their folks. And then the next slide is the point of flexibility. You need to be flexible both with yourself and with your staff. You know, we have to admit that we're going through all of this too as leaders, but we need to be able to say that so that we can connect with people, but at the same time be able to quickly pivot to issues that other people are also experiencing. There's an example here that we're using with the work from home pledge that IBM has put together, and they actually relied upon a process called values jamming that it's a bottoms up sort of grassroots way of getting feedback from employees all over the world. And they used it in this instance to improve their ability to have everybody working from home. And you can see, you know, some of the things that they came up with here, and that all employees were asked to take this pledge, which is actually quite effective. I think that we'd all agree. And then on the next slide, you do need to remember that everybody is experiencing this quite differently. You can change slides there. And one of the things that I have worried about throughout the COVID pandemic is that phrase, we're all in this together. Well, on the one hand, there's nothing wrong with it. On the other hand, what it doesn't mean is we're all in this the same. And there are different groups of employees and people with different sets of facts and circumstances that are being impacted very differently by this crisis. And leaders need to be able to be aware of that because we could very quickly do damage to any efforts that we've had in the past around really being effective to handling the diverse needs of our employee constituents. And finally, in the next slide, this point of optimism. While not everybody has all the answers right now, and it isn't always easy to see exactly, how we're going to survive and thrive out of this, we do need to have, I think there was a point in the slide that Kate had that said we need to have the energy to reinvent. We need to be able to show that passion and that optimism for the future. This research that we're quoting here shows that 50% of people are worst case scenario thinkers, and that may surprise you. But my experience has also been that when there is an absence of information and an absence of clarity about the future, people will fill the void with their own narrative. And most of the time it is not positive. They expect the worst. So to be able to be aware of that and to at least start to paint a picture of the future for people so that they're not filling in the blanks with something that isn't accurate and isn't what you want them to be believing. This idea of emotional contagion is real. Optimism begets optimism, passion begets passion, and fear and worry also begets fear and worry. So it's one of the things that I think that even though leaders are worried for themselves and for their own families and about the business that they're running, they need to be able to sort of put some of that aside and be able to help and lift up people with some positive energy and optimism for the future. So let's talk now back to Kate about how perhaps we can start to prepare people for making this shift.
I did the terrible thing of keeping my microphone muted. Sorry about that. So as Alison said, what is it going to take to prepare leaders to operate in this new world? And if you'll go to the next slide, it's really about having an intentional plan to upskill leaders and managers to meet the moment. This isn't going to happen without some effort, and we're encouraging organizations to really think proactively about how they develop a plan for targeting different groups of individuals and leaders in their organization at the right time to help manage both the reentry to work and what work will look like in the future. And if you go to the next slide, you can see that we're calling this the great re-onboarding. We think that, as I said at the beginning, the future of work is going to look different. We don't know what it's going to look like. And as Alison took you through just now, it's going to require a set of skills that are going to allow leaders to really help people manage themselves and their people manage through this. And so we think of it more as not so much a reentry, but a re-onboarding people to the new reality of work, what work will look like going forward. And if you go to the next slide, you'll see that we think that means upskilling managers and leaders in a couple of key areas. First, in a post-COVID world or a world before we have a vaccine, that means really understanding what the new operational protocols are. And we know from this KRC research that Alison mentioned that one of the things that causes the greatest anxiety with employees who are working remotely now is that they're going to be asked to come back to work before they're truly ready. And when they do, they want to know what the company has done to protect their safety. So before employees come back, it's important that leaders get a chance to really get their heads around what's that going to look like? What are the new schedule hours and work locations? Are there testing protocols in place? What are the sanitation procedures that are put in place? And what is the office going to look like? And before managers can really communicate that to their own people and allay fears and anxiety, they need to understand that themselves. Second is the broader leadership skills that really are what Alison was just talking about. And these, take a little bit more time to really develop and intent in the training that organizations develop, but they address things like employee health and safety, the mental health piece we talked about, which is not something, that leaders have traditionally had to do a lot of thinking around, but being able to identify issues going on in your team and point people in the right direction or check in on them at the right times is going to be really critical. Building an inclusive team. This is not something that, there's a lot of training that needs to go into that, but we have to start somewhere. And so what do we do to help people understand what does a truly inclusive team look like as we also tackle other things like, looking at processes and systems that need to be rebuilt for the longer term. Building personal resilience. This is really about going back to the point that leaders need to attend to their own needs before they can attend to those of others. So how do they really dig down? What do they need to do for themselves to build the resilience to sort of manage and navigate through this situation? Leading a hybrid team, for the foreseeable future, it's unlikely that organizations are going to bring all their employees back. So how do they manage a team where some might be in an office, some might be remote, or all might be remote? As we've mentioned, there are companies that are already going to a fully remote work environment. And finally, having difficult conversations, which a lot of managers have been thrown headlong into in this situation, and likely isn't going to change. The need for continued organizational change, probably more layoffs, all of these things. How do we get leaders to really get comfortable having those kind of tough conversations? If you go to the next slide, we've thought this is a concept that we've developed to really, it's one way of looking at what this re-onboarding might look like, and we're calling it Reboot Camp for leaders. And so if you think of a large organization where people might be going back to work at different times across the globe and facing different challenges, this is sort of a real-time leadership development program that will help address some of the goals are ensuring leaders' well-being, reducing anxiety, and providing a seamless experience to employees when they come back. And you can see at the top, this is really based on understanding manager and leader needs and doing some surveying to understand, what gaps individual leaders need to fill so that a program can be tailored for them. And you'll see in this camp experience, it's made up of a few different things. One is having live sessions with leadership. So leaders can really have the chance to ask their own questions real time and have them answered by leadership. How did they make decisions about coming back? What are the safety protocols? They get a chance to really talk to the team that's been in charge of that work. On-demand training gets at all the skills I talked about on the previous slide and is modularized so that if you're a leader who feels like you need 3 or 4 of these modules, you can have a tailored program for you in real time. And then finally, we've had a great response to this, the concept of virtual walkthroughs. So in addition to understanding the safety protocols and what the office will look like, getting a chance to actually see it before you're there. And that's something that ultimately we, suggest extending to employees, but starting with leaders. And then also built into this concept is the idea of a virtual concierge service, so that when people do return to the office, leaders have a real-time resource to call and ask questions of and get resources to help them manage the return to the office. Next slide. So this is a topic that we'll, I think, address more in our next episode, but leading for the long term is really going to be the ultimate leadership challenge. As we've said throughout this session, we think that the workplace is going to change for good in a lot of different ways. And one of the interesting things we've really heard from leaders, if you go to the next slide, is many of them are starting to say that some of the silver lining here is that some of the changes that have happened in this period of time have helped them accelerate change that was already underway, or have helped them break down boundaries in their culture to create a more collaborative environment, a less hierarchical environment. So the question is, coming out of this, once we've managed through the reentry phase, what do leaders need to do to really take the learnings from this period and accelerate change and institute new ways of working that are going to help them deliver on their business strategies and new ways for the future. So next slide. And we know that to do that, there are some things that leaders need to expect in the coming months. As I mentioned, the acceleration of change and the new urgency, and in response to that, how do they really lean into that and use this as a period, again, with the silver lining, to push forward things that, might normally take months or years to happen? We've got a client who is working on organizational change, and in this time period has been able to break down boundaries and make some of those changes much more quickly than might have happened otherwise. We know that there's going to have to be a reevaluation of projects, priorities, and resources. So really taking a step back and doing a lessons learned on this time period again and understanding what are the things we really want to focus on going forward. What needs to take a back seat? What are we going to stop, and do differently? Affirming values and critical behaviors. We've had a number of clients say that they really relied on and Alison mentioned this, on their organizational values to help guide through this crisis. And they've fallen back on them time and time again to make tough decisions, to come out and speak up on issues. And we've seen the need for those values to be very clearly articulated and understood, and also have behaviors beneath them that employees, leaders can model, and employees really understand, what the culture is meant to be. And so in this, it's both looking at the values and also doing a gap analysis to understand, where are we really adhering to what we say we stand for, and where do we need to do work to improve. There's a redefinition of the employee experience. We know, again, that work is going to look different. Employees are likely to ask if they can continue working from home in the long term. We've heard clients talk about giving up some of their real estate so that employees can do that. We've talked about having a different contract with employees going forward. We've talked a lot about how do we accelerate our efforts in the DEI space to create a truly inclusive workforce. So we have already seen a lot of organizations lean into that and start asking the question of, do we need to be thinking right now about how we change policies and procedures for the long term? Alison talked about number 5, bringing the anxiety and desire for discussion in the workplace. And she talked about the example at State Street and bringing that discussion and opening the boundaries for that discussion in the workplace. And we think that's going to continue to happen. And how do leaders really embrace that and create the space for that in meaningful ways that not only allows people to share their feelings, but also to use that information to make change in the organization going forward. And we also know that we've all said before the COVID crisis that the pace of change is relentless. That's one of the things we hear from clients the most, and it certainly isn't going to change in this situation. So how do we continue creating a culture that's adept and used to ongoing change? If you go to the next slide. Just a few key takeaways from today's session for you to keep in mind. And as Sarah said, we'll be sharing the deck from today, but everyone is facing anxiety and uncertainty, even leaders themselves. And so that's a context that leaders need to keep in mind as we move forward. Compassionate leadership is what's most needed in today's environment. We know that not all leaders have the skills they need to manage through this time, and that companies really need to help them acquire them in real time and prepare the organization for the future. And we know that leaders and managers have a critical role to play in helping people navigate and think about what does the future organization look like, and really defining the future of work. So with those key takeaways, on the final slide, I just want to share a few resources. If you're thinking more about leadership, training, and how to upskill your leaders and managers, HBR Managementor is a great resource. The Center for Creative Leadership is a terrific organization. And of course, we couldn't resist talking about our very own United Minds and the work that we do to help build the capabilities of leaders and coach them for the world ahead. And with that, I'm going to turn it back over to Sarah to moderate some questions.
Terrific. And thank you so much, Kate and Alison, for that very helpful overview. You guys both have so much rich experience as leaders yourselves, and know that you've also done a great deal of coaching leaders in other organizations or in client organizations. So appreciate your expertise and want to be sure that our audience can hear a bit more from you. So let's turn to some Q&A. The first question that I'll put to you guys, I think, is a good one around the profile of a compassionate leader. And this individual is asking, do you feel the traits of successful leaders today are born or made qualities? Said another way, do you feel these traits can be learned through coaching or training? And Alison, I don't know if you want to take that one.
Yeah, I'll at least start. I do think that some people are more adept at this just naturally, and that it's not. Some of these attributes are not sort of second nature to some people, or maybe natural talents. But I also believe that you can get better at each of these attributes. I was talking to a leader just yesterday who is feeling very, very vulnerable right now. She is a very sort of quantitative type of a person, excels in certain areas, and very, very, very bright, but is struggling with some of the issues as that were listed on those attributes that just aren't, they're not her comfort zone. But she's very open-minded to the feedback and is working very hard to improve. So I do think people can improve. They just need to understand what behaviors are derailing and what behaviors will lead to success, and do the research, look at the role models, and start to model the right behavior. I do believe people can improve in these areas.
Thank you, Alison. So I want to turn to talk about another topic, which is some of the changes that we might see in the makeup of leadership teams going forward. This individual asks, as you pointed out, not everyone has the attributes required to practice good leadership during this time. How should organizations be thinking about assessing their leadership for the right traits and making transitions, particularly given that there's already significant disruption, going on right now? Kate, do you want to say a word about that?
Sure. I think that's actually a question we were talking about before we got on this live session today, and I think that that there will be some redefinition of, if the future of work shifts and what work looks like and how people are working shifts, and some of the skills that Alison has mentioned are more paramount, I think that we are going to have to relook at leadership attributes and competencies, and that goes to how do people get assessed and developed, and who is most likely to progress in the organization. So I do think I think in this time we've seen some people naturally rise to the leadership challenge that we've had in front of us. But I think going forward, as we talk about what the future of work looks like and the types of leaders that we need in that setting, it's going to call for some redefinition of the capabilities and the criteria, and people will be measured, against that. And as Alison said, I think there are natural born leaders. I 100% believe that, but I think there is an opportunity with data and the right coaching and development for people to lean into those new criteria. I think that the pace of change is rapid at the moment, and so I think that is going to happen sooner rather than later. Alison, anything you'd add there?
I think there's always a hesitancy to add more change to an already complicated situation, but I think you have to really evaluate that, because if you stick to a formula that is not bringing you into the future with the pace that's going on, of change that's going on in the world today, you could be doing serious harm to an organization. So I do think decisive, clear-eyed changes in some leadership teams, I think we're going to see it. I also think that, back to a point I made earlier, the first thing you have to do is explain to people what it is you need from them as leaders, and give them the opportunity to be able to adapt. If they aren't able to adapt, I do think we're going to start to see some changes.
Great, and I think on that same topic about what changes we might see in the makeup of leadership teams, somebody else has asked this interesting question: what impact do you think this combination of crises will have on the demographics of top leadership teams or top leaders in the next year or so? Do you think this will be a global change or mostly in the United States?
So from my perspective, I think the change has already started, albeit slow, and it's being handled differently in different parts of the world. In some places, it's being more legislated than it is in the United States, as an example. Although in California, they have, from a governance perspective, they have put some guidelines in place. So I think it will probably accelerate, the kinds of changes that you're referencing. I am not yet very optimistic that we'll see dramatic change in the next year. I do think some organizations will get on it fast and will make dramatic change, but I do think that it will accelerate what I consider to be very, very slow change in the United States right now. I'm an independent director, and it's a sphere that I pay a lot of attention to, and the diversity of corporate boards in the United States is woefully lacking. So there's enormous room for improvement, and my hope is that in the next year it will accelerate, but I do think it's going to take more than the next year to get to a place where I would consider it to be much more equitable.
Thank you, Alison.
I would just add one point there. I think, I agree with Alison. I think one of the issues is we have to fix the pipeline of leader, for there to be, and that's where we get into the systemic issues. There's got to be a strong pipeline of leaders. And so I do think organizations are going to lean quickly into that, but the pace of it and how quickly they can get the right pool and pipeline in place may mean a slightly slower than we'd like to see. We have seen things like the Reddit co-founders step down and make space for someone to take his spot, which I think is really interesting. It'll be interesting if we see who else might do that, or what other moves we may see to accelerate change in that area.
So there are a number of questions around what leaders and people managers can do specific to certain issues to help their people. And one of the issues we've covered previously in this webinar series, but is really around emotional and mental health. And the question is, how would you recommend training and engaging managers to help with critical conversations, especially with employees that may need emotional support or mental health assistance? How do we teach those managers to know the signs and increase awareness? And then a related but slightly different question, how can leaders and managers create stability and security for their employees when the situation is so dynamic and uncertain? So two very kind of specific questions about how leaders can help in these areas. The first one around mental and emotional health, and the second one around stability and security.
So on the mental and emotional health front, I think that we haven't done a lot to train leaders and managers to, first of all, I think there's a piece around listening, which is what Alison has talked about, really understanding and creating the space for employees to share concerns with you as a leader. And then we're not suggesting that leaders need to be a therapist. They need to know how to spot critical issues and then connect their employees with the right resources. And I think that has to be done through training. I don't think that is a natural thing that leaders have typically been trained to do, but I think we'd seen a little bit of it before this crisis, and that demand has accelerated during this crisis. I think in terms of the question on stability, there is not going to be stability for some time. This is a period of history in organizations that I think is going to continue to, be defined by rapid change. What I think leaders can do are some of the things Alison, talked about. It's about transparency, communication. In the episode we did on mental health a couple weeks ago, we talked about even just understanding that this is an extraordinary time period, and it's perfectly natural for people to feel anxious, helps de-escalate some of the anxiety. So being able to help people understand what information is available, maybe what's not changing, and how and when they're going to hear more information. I think those skills are going to be really important, because I don't think it's going to become a stable situation anytime soon.
Yeah, thank you, Kate. So I think we have time for one final question here, and Alison, I think I would direct this one to you, but Kate, please feel free to chime in too. I'm assuming this is coming from somebody in an HR leadership role, and they are asking, what do you think the most impactful HR or people leaders should be doing right now to ensure their own future of work looks different a year from now? And what do you think that change should look like?
Yeah, I think if I understand the question right, the way I would frame it is, as I've been talking and listening to HR leaders in the past couple of months, one of the things I'm hearing from them, ironically, is that the HR agenda is now more front and center now than it ever was, and for the good HR organizations that have had a really good people agenda that's tied to the business strategy, that if perhaps there are issues that have been lingering that need to be addressed, you've got the attention of the leaders of the organization, and you are now in the spotlight. Don't waste a good crisis. Really use this opportunity to leverage the people agenda that you have. Maybe it needs to be tweaked. But I know there were times throughout my career where I felt like it was kind of a battle, to get some of the issues that I thought were important for the organization on the people agenda to the top of the agenda, because they weren't considered mission critical perhaps, but people are mission critical right now. And I do think we have to be able to really leverage that to make progress in the HR agendas across all of these organizations. It's funny because as exhausted as I think good HR people are right now, I also think that they feel kind of energized because they are able to have an impact in a very, very difficult situation. So I do think that, good HR organizations are going to come out of this even stronger in leading the future of the companies that, we've been referring to.
Great. Well, I want to thank Kate and Alison and everyone who has joined us today. We hope that you found the information useful, and will, of course, distribute the slides and the recording. We have our final session in the webinar series next Friday at noon Eastern, and that will be focused on designing the new employee experience. Building on some of the things that Kate shared today, we'll be looking at structurally, physically, and culturally what the future of work might look like. So we hope you'll join us again for that. And in the meantime, have a great weekend and a wonderful week ahead. Thank you all.